James Ashby, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks.
What have you been up to today? You're a busy guy.
Well, Senate's actually sitting. I've managed to pull a week where, because I had meetings here locally, I didn't go to Canberra, so it worked out well.
For those who don't know who you are, do you mind giving me a little bit of your introduction, what your role is at the moment, what you're doing for work?
So 7 years ago, after Pauline Hanson was first elected to the Senate, I took on the role of Senior Advisor and Chief of Staff. Yeah, so since that period, the last 7 years have been a very interesting period for me, because One Nation have actually held quite an instrumental role in certainly federal politics in the Senate, where we've had a shared balance of power with some of the other crossbench. And then at the end of this last federal election, we sort of relinquished that because now the Greens and David Pocock hold that mantle.
People who find out you work for Pauline are going to potentially throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of going, like people do, oh, she said this, I can never vote for her, blah, 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 insert whatever you want. Why do you think it's important that One Nation play a role in our federal political sort of landscape, or state for that matter as well? Why is that important? Or minority parties generally there, if we include teal candidates, let's say, and the parties like the Freedom Party or whatever. Why do you play an important role in our current political system?
Well, firstly, I think that whole idea of the old One Nation, or the belief of what One Nation stood for back in 96, 97, 98, I think that's gone these days. And largely it's because of platforms like what you've got here, social media, have allowed independents and other minor parties an opportunity to be heard in full, not sound bites, and therefore the conversation is a lot broader. People can take from that whole conversation what is meant, rather than a 5-second clip that the news outlets play overnight time, and can be perceived one way or the other depending on how it's cut up. So we're seeing minor parties and independents have a clearer voice these days, and that's why we've seen the major parties. Who would have thought 20 years ago that we'd see a government elected with less than 33% of the primary vote? That's what we currently have. And the only reason they've been able to form government is because of relationships with either the Greens, in this instance. Labor have done deals through preferences with the Greens now for decades. What we're seen as a minor party now have got more than a dozen elected members in the Senate. And then, of course, they've got the lower house as well. So that's where a government have been able to form on such very low primary numbers. Then, of course, Labor have got the backing of the Teals, who are more progressive. Then they've got people like Andrew Wilkie and other crossbenchers in the lower house that are helping them form governments. But putting it quite simply, the Australian voters don't necessarily believe in the two-party system anymore. And that's why we're seeing the Liberal National Party and Labor struggle to form majority governments. So that's proving difficult for them, whether it be state government or federal government.
And is that a good thing, because it allows for minority parties, it requires them to have a conversation with them, make deals with them, and then gives more power to some of those opportunities?
I believe voters are waking up to the fact that once you're in a major party, you actually lose your voice. If you're a backbencher, you don't have a say. You must vote with the party, particularly with Labor. There are the rare opportunities that the Liberal National Party give their members to cross the floor, as they call it, vote against the party, in other words, the party's position. But in Labor, if you cross the floor, you're gone. You're done. You're out. You can't be with the Labor Party. They'll either kick you out during the term of Parliament, or they'll simply not give you pre-selection come the next election.
Very interesting. How that has sort of, I guess, changed over time. What can we learn from the politics of old? And we've got some really big names that we like to think of, in American politics in particular, the Abraham Lincolns and the, in our era even of recent days, the John Howards and things like that. What made those people who they were in your mind, and what's required to redeem faith in our modern day political system?
I see politicians of Tony Abbott and John Howard, which a lot of people would remember and recognise. I think those days are temporarily gone. And I say temporarily because I don't believe the current Labor and Liberal National parties actually know who they are anymore. Labor Party used to be a party for the worker. The Liberal Party used to be for conservatives, and certainly mindful of the important role that small business and big business play in ensuring jobs for those people who may be looking for security. Nowadays, we've got less security in the workforce because of casual work. We've got a Labor Party who aren't interested anymore in the worker. They're more interested in feel-good subjects and leaning and lurching further and further to the left to try and bring back votes that the Greens are taking. Coalition are recognising that the majority of voters now situated in our capital city areas, so their Conservative base, which is predominantly regions, are getting less of a say because they've got to win the majority of seats to form a government. So what's happening is they're further and further lurching to the left. And so that's why we're seeing the Coalition sign up to UN agreements. We're seeing them more and more, their UN agreements. We're seeing the Liberal National Party, they're the ones that signed up to Paris Agreement, Kyoto. They're the ones that are signing up, taking away farmers' rights, implementing green policies where farmers are just having renewable projects put on their property whether they like it or not. We're seeing landscapes transformed simply because of green policy where we're putting windmills on what should be picturesque scenery, and where we are here in central Queensland. I'd hate the idea of our hills around Yeppoon or the Keppels or on Mount Archer to be littered with solar panels and wind turbines, but that's precisely what the Liberal National Party have signed up to. And their idea is, well, we thought we'd sign up to it because we've done a better deal than what Labor would have. I don't understand why the Liberal National Party have lost their sense of looking after the rural, regional and conservative people of this country. It's a very confusing political landscape, and that's why I don't think people quite understand who their parties are anymore. Labor don't know who they are. Liberal National Party have lost who they are, and that's why voters are going and turning to minor parties who actually have got somebody who knows who they are leading. Pauline Hanson, we all know who Pauline Hanson is and what she stands for. You may not agree with everything she says, but at least you can trust the things that she says she's going to follow through with.
Is part of the problem that you end up with this big middle ground and then these really far, people talk a lot about polarisation of our modern political thing, and so you end up on the fringes, you end up feeling like you have to go to these extremes, like vote Greens or vote for minority conservative parties like One Nation, and so then there's this really big divide in the or polarisation in the modern voter, or is it because the two major party system has just become so vanilla and just filling the middle section?
Well, it is very vanilla at the moment. There's no one party that's willing to take too many risks at the moment. No voter is stupid. No politician is stupid. But there's a lot of ignorance out there. And that ignorance is because we're either too busy or we listen to sound bites. No one actually takes the time any longer to read policy. No one looks deeply into what the Greens stand for. There's an assumption that the Greens stand for environmental causes, but they run a whole lot deeper than that, to the detriment of most Australians. Because if you have a look at their policy, and if you have a look at Labor's policy, they've signed up to so many of these UN agreements which actually have more interest in overseas than what they do here locally and domestically for the people that already live here. That's why we've got immigration levels at the numbers we do. Why? Because we've signed up to UN deals. And we know that if we don't allow more and more people in, the Liberal National Party were as bad, not as bad, but if we don't allow all these people in, our GDP fails and all of a sudden we end up in a recession. So it's a Ponzi scheme that a lot of them are working on. But going back to that ignorance, we're ignorant to the fact that the policies are there. They're in black and white, but we just don't have time to look them up. And so we're making decisions based on sound bites or our assumption of what a party stands for, when in actual fact, the political landscape's changed.
One of the things that I want to do in using the conversations I have here are in the upcoming elections that we have locally is inviting members to partake in a form of long-form conversation on an individual level with local candidates, because I think that may give voters more of an opportunity to get to know their local member or whoever wants to be their local member, and elaborate on these personalities that we do get these sound bites from, you know, our local state MPs and federal MPs and whatevers. Do you think that's a good thing, or
Sure. If they'll open up.
do you think they'll do it?
Yeah, they probably will. But are you getting the thin veneer side of a politician, or are you getting them raw? That's the biggest issue. I'm not one for a suit. I find suits just misleading. I find it's a facade that politicians have got to be squeaky clean and perfect, and they can't be themselves. But and I'll work around politicians all the time. There's probably only a handful I'd feed on both sides, in honesty, because I don't feel as though I'm getting the honesty out of all of them. So I wish you all the best of luck trying to get them to open up and be honest with the people, because that's what I think most people are looking for, is a bit of honesty, a bit of genuine discussion. People want to be able to go up to a politician and have that conversation, but a lot of them lock themselves away from the public. And I think that is where we're getting that ignorance from politicians, and decisions that have been made not for the betterment of the country or the local area or the state, because they feel as though they don't have to go and consult with people on a one-on-one basis. That's dangerous, because as we've seen here locally, we've now banned certain types of fishing right up and down our east coast and on the west coast of Queensland. People forget we've got a west coast at times. But we've banned gillnet fishing without really any consultation amongst the people who it's most going to affect. And as a result of that, it's too late now for that industry as it stands. But there was no consultation. 5 weeks was all that was given to an industry, and not one politician bothered to go out and talk to the fishermen themselves. The fishermen were expected to know that legislation was about to change, and then put through a submission to a body that probably wasn't even read by a politician. So we got both sides voting on legislation that they had no idea about, and yet it impacts so many people. In fact, it impacts upon most Queenslanders, most Australians, because we're effectively taking fresh fish that's caught off our coastline, off the market, and now we're relying on imports from other countries, and no one knew about it. No one. Certainly not the average shopper. And then for that matter, you got fishermen that are only learning after the fact, after that time's closed for them to make a submission. They're learning their industry's just been shattered. And so that's the impacts we're seeing by politicians not having a true connection to their local areas.
On a policy development front, what actually happens? You know, I guess it's pretty topical right now to talk about some of the COVID policies, but just generally like that type of, you know, thing regarding, you know, the banning of gillnet fishing in certain areas. Green policies we're seeing come through, and, you know, on both sides people sign up to. Do people actually want this, or is it something that politicians think that people want, so they're just looking good to the public on them, or they are... There's this other area in government making decisions that I kind of just think maybe some things fit into, and I'll explain the premise of it. It's government have this really tricky balance of doing what they want making decisions and in developing policy based on what they know people want because they've been informed through that consultation process that you just touched on. But it's also doing things that they know or think are best for that population, like mandatory seatbelt wearing that Australians didn't want, but they did and supposedly saves lives. How does the government and are the decisions they're making informed on lunacy, informed opinion from people, or this other area of, well, we think this will be best for people, so even though we're copying backlash from it, we're going to do it anyway?
There's so much interference now on a state, federal and local government level from agreements we've signed up on international terms. And I can't tell you how many pieces of legislation I see on a federal level that come across our desk, and if you actually have a look at where the basis of that legislation has come from, typically it's come from the UN. And we're seeing it affect our reef, our land decisions. So departments never lose their jobs, so to speak, people within those departments. And we're seeing a really top-heavy department makeup these days. Politicians are only really in place for 3 or 4 years. So on a state level, 4 years, federal level, 3 years. Those politicians come and go. But it's generally the people behind the scenes that stay there. They are dictating the path in which politicians often take. And if you go against often the department, you hear this from both sides, by the way, politicians who have been ministers, that have had the opportunity to change the path for the better or for the worst, if they had their time again, they'd say, I wouldn't listen to the bureaucrats within the department. It's too late. Too late. And I've spoken to former prime ministers, I've spoken to former premiers who all say the same thing. Either given very poor advice, and let's face it, it's difficult when you're in government. And I don't say that lightly. It's difficult. It's difficult when you're in the crossbench as well. And you've got to stay across every bit of legislation. It's very little time. At the end of the day, we're only in Parliament federally. Last year we were there for 18 weeks. I think this year the same. Next year's only 15 weeks. So you've got very little opportunity to do that research. So you're relying on the advice of departments, lobbyists, business, those it's going to affect. And so sometimes you can get bogged down, but I think where our country is going is largely being driven by the departments, not necessarily by parties. And if you have a look, as we saw in the Voice to Parliament referendum, Canberra, very left-leaning. They were the only, territory, no states voted for it. They were the only territory out of the whole country to vote for the Voice to Parliament. And it's very left-leaning policies that are coming out of there that are then having an impact on every single one of us across the country. And politicians, sadly, are just allowing it to go through.
So that should be a concern to most Australians, is that take the Voice to Parliament of recent times, you have the capital of Australia being Canberra, and the people who live there voting one way on something and almost the entirety of Australia voting another way.
Yeah.
And then the concern is that they're the ones making at least the foundational policy decisions, and or obviously you have to put policy before government to then agree or disagree on it, or then how it gets implemented is a different thing. But half the things that are talked about, from my opinion, I go, why are we even talking about that? There's this thing over here happening. So they're just maybe out of touch is potentially where that ball lands.
Hugely. And so are many of the people within the party. I can assure you, both sides of politics, doesn't matter who's in government. I've seen it so many times where an MP, the bells will ring. The bells ring for a few minutes, depending on which parliament you're in, which indicates you've got to get to the chamber for a vote. And I have been in conversations on the way down to the floor of Parliament. Obviously, I don't vote, but as a senior advisor, I'm often involved in those conversations with other members of Parliament. And I'll say to them, what's your feelings on this ledge that you're about to vote on? I still am told. That's frightening. That is so frightening. They rely on the minister of their government, or they rely on the shadow minister, which is the opposition's version of a minister that oversees which way the party goes. And so for a lot of these MPs in that parliament, they're unclear on what even the legislation means.
That's concerning.
Hugely.
So what do Australians do to change it?
Well, I think they've got to take more of an interest in who you're voting for, first and foremost. And this is why I think a lot of the independents are getting a look in these days. It's one thing to vote for your favourite party. Those parties have changed significantly. And that's why, as I say, a larger and larger proportion of people, they're changing the way they vote. A lot of the minor parties and independents are getting a look in. They don't see the faith in either of the major parties. And they're looking for leadership too. I don't see many people very passionate about any of the leaders that we've got. They might be rusted on Labor or Liberal National Party voters, but they're not really out there saying that the leader that each of those parties have are that inspiring.
Yeah, I definitely. I've met Peter Dutton and I've met Anthony Albanese, and you would say nice blokes, like, you know, good guy or whatever. But I think it's very fascinating to see. I'll take an example from like a personal development side, right? You've got guys like Jordan Peterson and Jocko Willink, you know, ex-military guy, asking people to do really hard things, and their followings are massive. They're requiring high standards from people who to fix their lives and take responsibility and do hard things. And people are flocking to their message. From a political side, it's interesting that you have people like the Trumps who are, you know, love or hate or whatever, are just out there being who they are, and they've got this really radical base of support because they're saying what they think. Maybe they should shut up a little more, but you know what I mean? On certain things, like, you don't need to talk about that. Focus on what you... Do people, again, in the vanilla political party two-system leadership level, are they just being what they think people want? Are they, like, you know, Peter Dutton's an ex-copper.
Yep.
Like, far out, just, you know, just get a bit of, get your blood pumping and, you know.
Yeah, but have a look at the police today. One of the biggest faults that we've got with the police at the moment is they've been nobbled. Coppers are as frustrated as anybody else. And I see this new wave of policing as not working. That's why juvenile crime's so high. Our crime rate across the state's going up. It's not just here, it's everywhere. But go back to those days where politicians stood for something. John Howard had one of the greatest challenges of his life in getting elected at a point when he was trying to sell the GST. It had already failed under Hewson once before. Australians rejected GST because it was very poorly explained. So he had a tough challenge on his hand when Howard introduced GST, which I think came in 2000, just prior to the Olympics. The point is, he stood for something. We knew what he stood for. Abbott stood for something. He actually went to an election and said what he was going to do and followed through with it. What have the current politicians said they're going to do that's going to make this country any better? Anthony Albanese certainly didn't go to the last election with any firm commitment for this country. In fact, his only commitment was he was going to be transparent and was going to listen more. Well, that's the last thing we've seen out of this Prime Minister. No transparency at all.
Reduced cost of living was a big kind of...
And he hasn't done it.
A subtle promise. Yeah.
They're all motherhood statements. And it's easy to make motherhood statements in life. We can all say that we want to do something, but how many of these people do you see following through? None of them. None. We're starting to see a little more backbone out of Peter Dutton. And I like Peter Dutton. He's a genuine man. And if I was to market the man, the hardest point would be getting him to meet everybody. I say the same thing about Pauline Hanson. Get her to meet people. Yeah. You'll like her. You'll really like her. Peter Dutton's exactly the same. and his presence is it's different. You know, he's no supermodel. He's quite reserved in his approach, and that's fine. But when you're trying to attract the majority of voters to follow you, you've got to have something more. If you don't have the looks and if you don't have the personality, you've got to be something more. You've got to have policies that people can believe in, and you've got to be able to sell them. And I haven't yet seen that. It's starting to appear, but you know, these election cycles are so short. You've got to be driving that message from the start.
There's a business guy I like to listen to, Alex Hormozy, who's just amassed a massive following of recent days. And he was saying how people would say of him, "You're so interesting. The things you say on camera, so you're such an interesting person. That's why you've found this success." And he says, "No, I'm just myself."
Yep.
And most people aren't themselves.
Yeah.
They try to be, it's that veneer thing you said. It's like people are trying to be this someone who they think people want them to be, and then you just end up in this really weird, like nothing kind of category with everyone else who's trying to be the thing that people think they want them to be, which is nothing. You just end up not having any kind of impact at all.
Oh, we've got plenty of them. We've got plenty of those people that aren't themselves. They're happy to say what they need to get re-elected. But what do they stand for?
Back to the bureaucratic sort of elements of our government that you sort of touched on, there's a presidential candidate in the US right now, Vivek Ramaswamy, who has a very extreme proposal for what he's going to do if he gets elected. And that's on day one, or within a period of time, fire 50% of all bureaucrat public servants. And his proposal, again, it's hard to know whether these things are true or not, but he, in terms of when he says them, like, what does that actually mean in terms, he said the way he was going to do it was look at someone's social security number, and if it was an odd number, you're in, and if it's an even number, you're out, type of, like, that was going to be potentially the way at the start of just bringing everything back. Not saying you couldn't rehire people who were actually good once you get to know whatever. Is that what something like our government needs? You know, Campbell Newman kind of got ousted because he went a little too hard, too fast on some things, amongst other things. But like, how do we actually change this? And I want to talk about then into how do we restore people's faith in democracy?
Well, IR laws here in Australia are completely different to those over in the United States, which probably makes it very difficult for anyone to suggest that here. And you're right, the last time that was somewhat proposed through a redundancy or natural attrition process that Campbell Newman introduced really backfired. And that was because public servants, bureaucrats, largely vote Green or Labor. It's just something we've got to face here in Australia. And I would...
For people who... Can I quickly, to butt in, can I quickly outline, from what I understand, when you look at the type of person who is, say, out there running their own business and working hard for themselves versus someone who just gets up and goes to work. Nothing wrong with working in, you know, some state planning job or doing whatever you're doing. What tends to happen is the types of people that you attract in those types of roles think a particular way, are in those jobs because they think a particular way. So politically, they're going to lean a particular way. That's from... Because you can go, oh, why is that? Oh, that's just nonsense. But it's true, because if you outline sort of, I guess, the realities of what those types of situations create, that's what you have.
Well, in business, you've got to use this and not so much of this. When you're a public servant, it's like the switch is flicked the other way. People use more of this. And unfortunately, you know, I'd love to be able to say yes to absolutely everything that either a staff member or the public wants. But the reality is you'd send a country broke if you did that. And decisions just can't go down that path. You just can't do it. Our government, our country should be run like a business. We have to use more of this. And sure, apply some heart, by all means. We do that. But it's got to be more of the thinking side of things. We just can't run off love and pure bliss, because that's not what this world is. We've got to make tough decisions. And in politics, you can't be loved by everybody. You've got to make the right decisions for the country and the betterment of moving forward. There isn't a long-term vision anymore either in politics like there was a few decades ago. Joe Bjelke-Petersen had vision. Howard had vision. But I haven't seen a great deal of vision since, because there's more an interest in winning, this constant winning. But if that's all you're worried about, you're never going to achieve things for people. And we have 2 shorter election cycles, 3 years in federal, which I often think is not long enough. Sometimes I wish we had 4 years, but then I look now and I think to myself, thank God we don't have a 4-year cycle under the current government that we have. Sooner that we go to another federal election, the better, because I don't see this one getting a second chance. But the problem that we've got is too many politicians are so focused on winning the next election rather than achieving during this current term.
So on the bureaucratic level, because I cut you off, what does that look like for Australia in terms of, I kind of interrupted, you were talking about Newman and his plan that backfired on him. What should Australians be looking for or hoping for? Because you hear it from people. Oh, the bureaucrats this and that. It's not those. The politicians are just puppets. Blah blah blah. Yet when it actually comes to day of putting a piece of paper in a booth, Teal candidates get elected, and it's like, what is happening here? Maybe because we're in an area that's very, for some reason, still votes Labor, yet ultra conservative. It's a very strange region that we live in, but I don't know.
Well, bureaucrats are unaccountable. There's no accountability. That's the honest truth. When you get a fine these days from a bureaucrat, whether it be a ranger or from a department, the ATO, you don't know who issued that fine. They're a number. Whereas a politician, rightly or wrongly, their face is out there. You got nowhere to hide. And sometimes as a politician, you got to wear the consequences of somebody else's actions. But what do? Do you name and shame some of these bureaucrats for some of their decisions? Because when you've got a project like the Snowy Hydro system that, stage 2 was promised to cost $2 billion, and here we are, it was supposed to be completed 2021. We're now 2023. It's cost $12 billion and is not complete, and is said to cost us $20 billion before it is. Well, who's accountable for that? Because the politicians were just working off the sums and the assumptions that were put out by a bureaucrat. There's no accountability. No one lost their job.
The politician will lose their job over the next election will come around and they'll lose their spot.
Yeah. And even still, when we get rid of some of these bureaucrats and we say we're not going to replace them, we then bring in contractors, which cost often twice as much, if not 3 times as much, and are 3 times less accountable than a person employed by the system. It's a vicious cycle. It's horrible.
That's a bit depressing.
Well, we're looking for hope, aren't we?
Oh, man. One of my subtle mantras that I've been working on of late is to help restore faith in our democratic system, because I believe in it. And it's the best system we have that we've seen work. I really don't know how to do that. I've put efforts into, on a local, personal level and business level, working on some things to connect local council with their community, because there seems to be an ability there to actually, it's the closest level of government to the people, and there seems to be an actual ability to, although their powers are limited, make real change. Businesses can go to their council and say, hey, this issue is affecting us. It could be parking in a particular area. It could be, a road upgrade that's needed. It could be this. And then they can go on behalf of that area to the state government or whatever and lobby for funding and do things like that.
Yep.
But that's how I see, okay, that's a 1%, that's a step in this direction of making this reality. Rallying people to have a conversation and hopefully see some tiny little change that's like, what else is there to do?
People have to take control. people need to realise that they actually have the final say during that election cycle. Take the time, get in touch with your MP, write to them, stay across Parliament. The ABC broadcast Question Time every day. I bet their listenership is minute, but you can log on, watch the Senate, watch the House of Reps all day long if you want. Do it, because you'll surprise yourself as to the behaviour that most of our politicians carry on with. They're supposed to be there in a serious capacity, looking after our needs and wants on a local level, but it ain't that grand. When you listen to Parliament or watch Parliament, it's not that great. I would encourage people to actually expect more from their politicians. And if you see behaviour that you're not happy with, let them know. Put it in writing. Don't pick the phone up, because it goes nowhere over the phone. But if it's in writing, there's actually a record of it. Make them take the time to write back to you. People don't spend time engaging with their politicians. Local council, I must admit, local council probably is the best form of direct one-on-one contact you can ever have with an elected member. But they are only an extension of the state government. They don't have really too much power.
On a hypothetical, what needs to happen then? What does a whole system look like that's actually got elected peoples who are... Is the 3 levels of government that we have the best way, or is it like 2? Is it a 2? Is it like, in some sort of... You've probably thought about this. What does a government designed by James Ashby actually look like?
Well, the system shouldn't change.
Okay.
We shouldn't be changing the way in which we still need those 3 levels. Federal, state, local government. One's not constitutionally recognised, that's councils. The other 2 are. The system has worked since Federation, 1901. That system has worked up until recently. So we've got to go back to the fundamental principles of why we established it this way. Every single one of these people were elected to represent us on a local level. They used to do it. So why isn't it happening now? I think the parties have got themselves they've tied themselves into knots. Every party is actually factionalised. If you have a look at it, the Liberal Party's factionalised, they've got the left or the moderates, and then you've got your Conservatives. Not too many Conservatives left in the Liberal National Party, I might just say. And then the Labor Party are factionalised based on the unions. And again, Conservative versus that of moderate or left. And then you've got the disruptors, being the Greens, that are pulling both further and further to the left. I don't think that there's proportional representation across our country anymore because of what we've done to ourselves. There's less people living in regional parts of the country. We're a bit different here in Queensland. We've got more people living outside of the southeast corner than we do down in the city, which is, thank goodness, a good thing. But there isn't proportional representation because the seats in regional parts of our country are so large that it's difficult for an MP to get around them and actually have that one-on-one connection. But also, too, in the southeast corner of Queensland, for example, where we use Queensland for an example because we're in the state, those seats don't want to talk about reef regulations that impact upon people up just north of us here, because their constituents care about the Great Barrier Reef. So do our constituents up further north, but they're not blinded by the truth. Again, the Southerners are just picking up on those sound bites that the Greens throw out there, that farmers are trying to kill the reef or miners are trying to kill the reef. We've been mining in this country for hundreds of years, and yet we haven't killed the reef. In fact, it's the best it's ever looked right now. And we haven't really changed anything. The practices haven't changed. So I really believe that don't change the system that we currently have. We've got to take more of an interest in it, that's all.
I like that. So what about on an individual, let's say I discussed this with Robert Schwarten when he was
Yeah.
here. The idea of these career politicians, and I don't think necessarily there's a problem with people who are in government for a long time if they're doing a good job. But again, if we go to the everyday person off the street, there's a common phrase that you hear something like, "Oh, is this the best we've got?" So you watch, like you said, go and watch, Parliament sitting and the discussions that happen and the behaviour that goes on. And you think, is this the best we've got? So where are the people? Where are the people who are the best we've got? And why are the people who are in government? Why are they there? Is it a power grab? Is it an easy job? Is it an extension of someone who's maybe was looking for to spend their life as a bureaucrat type of role, but then ended up in that public service, like more on the other side of as an elected member, and they're just doing all they need to be re-elected.
A lot of these people in politics, look, there's some very good ones. There are some very good ones that I'd hate to see a time limit placed on them because they're very good. And to lose those skill sets and their understanding of how the parliament works would be a real loss to everybody. But then there are those that are so incompetent, incapable. All they're good for is sitting on the backbench and just being a vote for their party. They'd never earn the money they do in the real world. We're talking about $220,000 for a backbencher in federal parliament. On a state level, it's approaching $200,000. Many of these people wouldn't be capable of earning that money if they were to go back into the real world. So they will do and say anything it takes to get re-elected and stay within that cushy confines of the bubble. And that's a real shame. They're the ones that have got to go. They offer nothing. I don't see parties, I hate the word groom, but they should be trying to focus on grooming that next younger person.
Robert Schwarten said that too about mentorship.
Yes.
He said there was like a bit of that happening back in the day that you kind of don't see as much.
No, and it's evident when you have a look at parties like the Liberal National Party. And I came from the Liberal National Party, so I'll own that. We've got other members of ours within our party that have come from Labor. And they say something very similar in the sense that they're not mentoring or grooming that next wave of young politicians that can take over the role that they're currently playing. I saw it happen in the Liberal National Party. It's like they ran out of talent. And then so they started taking from people from behind the scenes, those people who were known as the head kickers, the Barry O'Sullivans, the James McGraths, those types of people who actually had the back end of the party running quite well. Because they ran out of talent, or reward, I don't know what it was, whether it was reward or they lost the talent, but they gave them Senate positions. And now the party just seems to be treading water, if not going backwards. They're slowly sinking. And Labor's strength is they've got the unions. That's all they've got, because I can tell you as a party, they're not really mentoring or grooming the next up-and-coming rising star. Just look on their front bench. You tell me, if Anthony Albanese was to be hit by a bus tomorrow, who takes the role that you'd have any confidence in? Same with the Liberals.
So how should young people think about their involvement in politics beyond their duty as a citizen to be informed, potentially read some policy like you outlined, and get to know what their local member stands for and who they're voting for? What does the involvement look like? I've got some ideas about, for myself or for the recommendations that I make to others, that the perception of it should be more like military service, where you're doing something for your country. We pay homage to our veterans and those who serve and all that sort of thing, when there's this real disrespect upon our politicians. They're time wasters, it's a waste of taxpayer money, they're puppets, yada, yada, yada.
Yep.
It's a real shame because it just seems like this boot loop cycle of toxicity that it's like, what are you going to do to change it?
I'm always worried about the people that the sycophants to politics. I always worry about them. I always question when somebody is so super keen to be around you in politics when they actually don't have any real life experience. They worry me. Those kind of people worry me. What I think parties need to do is actually make the approach to people that they see as having potential of being a politician. It was never my intention to get involved in politics. Never, ever, ever. Never thought about it. I was a business person. I'd worked in my own business for 6 odd years. Before that, I'd worked in media for 9. I had a marketing background as a result of both those industries. I then went into agriculture, and I was a marketing manager for one of the biggest strawberry producers in the country. We were doing 20 tonnes of strawberries a day. So we were no small farm, and how my involvement in politics came about was because we were facing changes to legislation on water. And rather than sit back and wait for that legislation to come up and then have to battle it at the same time as the opposition were dealing with it, I took the approach, well, I'll go and make representation on behalf of our farm that I was working for and simply say what is being flagged as a potential change to legislation will actually cripple farmers in Queensland, will add to the cost of the grocery bill every week, and it won't work for anybody. And so it was only through, call it lobbying, I guess. I wasn't a lobbyist. I was just simply putting my case forward. And before I knew it, the Liberal National Party asked me to go and speak to a number of their groups. They call them FDCs. And so I did. I then went and appealed to the rest of their party on a local level. And it was only then that they started saying, well, listen, to have an impact, you should be part of our party. And so I did join them initially. But I walked away from the Liberal National Party because I never saw a commitment to follow through on the things that they showed interest in, but there was no commitment to actually offer any of the farming sector. So I walked away from them because it's important to me that I get a commitment out of somebody, not just weak sort of motherhood statements. So that's what I see with them, unfortunately.
Why do we let that happen? Why do we let people get away with that? Why do we re-elect a government who haven't fulfilled any of the promises? Is it that they'd said they would? Is it because our expectations are so low already that we just...
Largely. And I think most people within this country don't expect a politician to follow through. I really believe it's become that bad where people don't believe that a politician's going to follow through. We don't have anyone anymore that's believable. Tony Abbott was the last one. When he promised to stop the boats, and he did, I think that's the last promise ever really fulfilled by a government. It's very interesting, and it's so sad to see that's where politics has landed.
Let's talk about COVID. Which, by the way, kudos to members of your party.
Yep.
Being, in particular, Malcolm Roberts, who's asking some really good questions around a whole bunch of things in some inquiries at the moment.
Yep.
I enjoy his great questions, including, actually, which I saw recently, a question around the Australian federal funding of the UN and the 800, at least at the time the answer they gave was $800 million plus some sort of figure in there with of which their contribution goes to the UN, and you do start to wonder what do we actually get from that, other than some feebly ultra progressive policies that they say we should implement in our own country. I don't know. I don't know what we actually get out of it. Sorry, got off track. But yeah, the health, they because of this supposed distrust of politicians that we were just talking about, government decided to put public health officials
Yep.
front and centre on these decisions that were being made, which ironically has led then to a distrust in our modern medical system.
Sure. And if you dare spoke against the methods being implemented, let's not forget, although COVID only happened a couple of years ago, hasn't it slipped most people's minds how bad this country really, we were treated. Lockdown, in most states, lockdowns were severe, particularly in Victoria, the most lockdown state in the whole world. And I think the government are getting away with it because people's memories are so short term. It cost us dearly at the 2019 state election because we were on the opposing side where our views were that the measures put in place by not only this state government but state governments right around the country were too harsh. We said from the very get-go that the measures put in place were too harsh. I remember we were in Port Douglas at the time when Scott Morrison made an announcement that he was going to mandate the COVID vaccines. And I remember at that stage just thinking, what has this world come to? When I say we, Pauline Hanson and I quickly pulled out a video camera and posted something to social media suggesting we would be the first ones to oppose anything mandated, to which it got a lot of media attention at that time. And Scott Morrison, within 24 hours, backed down on mandating. But that's where, I think we played a role in at least peeling back some of the harsher decisions that governments, and I'll say that because it was federal and states, took at that time. But we're still getting over the effects of COVID, namely in the fact that we've got not enough workers within the country at the present moment. We lost a lot of those foreign workers that were here, either student visas or other visas. Now we've got a shortfall of workers. We also are suffering higher interest rates as a result of too much money being dumped into the economy at that time. And so we're paying the consequences of decisions that were made back then, and we probably will for another few years yet. There's been a lot of lessons learnt because no one got it right. Even we, as a party, have to admit that there were things or decisions that were made even through legislation that we supported that we would never support again. Especially the doling out of so much money over an extended period of time to people who were never ever used to, take for example, unemployment benefits were doubled. Now, unemployment benefits for people who had been unemployed for 5 and more years just instantly got this double whack of cash. They didn't need it. And we've run up huge amounts of debt that every single one of us are going to be paying for, not just my generation. I know you've got a handful of kids. They're all going to be paying for it. And chances are their kids too.
I think it was shocking to me, and to a lot of people, how I guess when it came to some restrictions, even here in Queensland, that some people disagreed with, the ability, let's say, to go down and have a beer at the pub with your mates, right? Yeah. Okay, in the interest of public safety, you can't do this thing. It's like it was sort of shocking to have a government make a rule that then, there was pushback against, that you just couldn't do anything about.
Yep.
That it's the totalitarian government that appeared out of seemingly nowhere, that suddenly we were like, can they do that? And it was like, yeah, they can. What? This is crazy. And we've forgotten. We've moved on quite quickly and forgotten how difficult it became for certain people. Although economically we kind of just, have just fancied and stimulated ourselves through this period of time, and property prices are booming, and there's a rental crisis, and we've got this real false sense of success, or
It is
thriving
false.
happening
Yeah.
amongst our society. Business is great. Yeah, how good, this and that. We've had a few good years. Forget that we were confined to our homes and that we couldn't meet with family.
But it really definitely needs a fine-tooth comb run over everything that we've done, because it's inevitable there'll be another pandemic of some sort, whether it be in our lifetime or beyond. We need to be able to look back on what worked and what didn't work, and then be able to use that to our benefit long term, because, we don't need another situation of people being locked down in their homes, the mental illness that was resulted from those lockdowns, we're still paying for. Some people lost their lives as a result of that. Others lost their lives by feeling the force of having to take a COVID shot that was not proven and tested. And how many young people have we known now that are either passed away as a result of having it through adverse effects, or are living with those adverse effects long term?
Yeah, it's a hard pill to swallow, and I guess we all have to accept the realities of what happened, like you said. And I think it's an important thing for you to say is we got it wrong, or we could have done this better, or whatever, and that reflection is super important.
Yeah.
What should young people be thinking about in terms of their involvement in politics then? Should people aspire to be involved in some way, run on and serve a term or two or three based on a particular issue? What's the usual process for parties to pick candidates? And are they going to the market to pick the best person, or are they picking from their little gang of young, I don't know what the formal names would be, the young LMPs, and there's probably some group of young people who are, and maybe that's just a popularity contest and whatever, and Labor probably have another version, whether it's through the unions or whatever else.
Yeah.
Are they going to market and getting the best candidates here, and how should young people approach the future?
Yeah, well, we know we're not getting the best people. It's getting harder and harder to encourage people to get into politics. And part of that's because no one's perfect. Everybody's done something in their life they're not proud of. And there's this perception you've got to be perfect to be a politician. You don't. In fact, the more bland, vanilla a person is, the less likely we are to get good outcomes. I want people that have tried, succeeded, failed, succeeded, in business. I want somebody that may have made mistakes when they're a teenager, may have made mistakes, later in life, may have had bust-ups in relationships that didn't go down so well. That's fine. I want people who've got life experience to get involved in politics. They're the people that should be involved in politics. But we're seeing less and less of it. You shouldn't aspire from a young age to be a politician, I don't believe. I certainly didn't. I was in my 30s when I first got involved in politics. And even after 7 years, I call this an apprenticeship. Working with Pauline Hanson's a big apprenticeship. But even after 7 years, I still haven't learned everything. I certainly learned a lot in my business time. I've certainly learned a lot and met a lot of people within my media career. But you've also got to have the passion. You can't just take on the role of a politician. It's winning the seat's the easiest part. Actually doing the work is the hardest. And it is hard work. If you want to get in there and actually achieve change for the positive or outcomes for people, you've got to work damn hard. And that's why a lot of people who do work hard lose relationships in politics. You have to be prepared for that. I also believe it's one of the reasons why a lot of women don't get into politics is because of the level of commitment that's required in those offices, that you're trading away the time spent with your kids and your family. And to a lot of women, that means a lot. So I understand why it's not that conducive to family environment. Once upon a time, politics was, you used to take somebody who'd proven themselves successful in business or within the community, and they were tapped on the shoulder, and it was almost like seen as your bit for the community. You'd been successful, you had the money behind you in the sense that you didn't need to work, and you went and did your time as a politician at the very end. It was really the public service time that you would spend through your success. But these days, those people, they just want to enjoy their retirement. So we're not getting the best people. And I don't know what it's going to take other than to go searching as a political party for the right people. Go back to the old school method of tapping somebody on the shoulder and saying, listen, I like the success. I like what you've done. I like what you're achieving for the community. Would you consider running as a politician? Because we think that you can broaden your scope. You can broaden the success that you've brought to yourself and your family. And we think you can bring it to our community as well.
I like that, and I think that's where my thinking or analogy of trying to perceive it the same as we do military service is something that should be seen as honourable. It should be seen as service to country, and it should be admired and respected and uplifted by the people who do it. And that's where I'd like to see it go back to. My question from before that I remembered was, and you can pull out your tinfoil hat for this one, was more that you said, there'll be another pandemic. I just wanted to unpack that a little bit, and what, if you read the Conspiracy Times, a lovely newspaper that doesn't exist, that, is that something like a climate emergency will be the next, is a great foundation for the limitation of, or suppressing of freedom. For example, like you can't drive a petrol car more than X number of kilometres a week, or you can't travel this far from your home, or you can't consume more than this much energy, or you can't eat more than this much meat, or like there's these. Why would the government do something like that? If they would, what do they have to gain from it in terms of going back to this thinking of government are trying to do what people want, while also trying to do what they think is best for a particular country. What does that next pandemic look like? Is it something like that? And why would they do that?
Well, I hate to tell you, but this is not a tinfoil hat moment that you're having, okay? It's not some conspiracy theory.
Is it tied in with the UN things as well?
I was just about to go back to that fact, is because there are these unelected bureaucrats sitting in the UN over in Europe that are coming up with these strange, bizarre requirements of countries, mainly first world countries, I might just add, like Australia. And you're exactly right. We're already at a situation now where the WHO, the World Health Organization, want countries to sign on to treaties or accords whereby they take control of your country and the way in which we deal with a pandemic moving forward. Now, they've just changed that again because Australia didn't sign on to it, and much of the rest of the world didn't sign on to it either. But these are, as I say, accords or treaties or agreements. Any of those three terms of phrase can be used because that's what the UN are using at the minute. But they're constantly trying to bring us on board with these signatories. And when you said about a climate emergency being treated like a pandemic, that was precisely what was written into their previous accord. Now, it's just changed. Earlier this year, they've released a new document that they're now hoping the rest of the world signs on to. But again, it's reducing or restricting the movement of people, not by our government. And they do it through this external powers part of our constitution. And that's how the government get away with signing on to it, is through external powers. And you can look it up. It's there in the constitution. It's how we make free trade agreements, for example, is through that instrument within the constitution as well. But unfortunately, there are some more sinister things that we've signed on to. And yes, we are doing away with combustion engines moving forward. We won't have any further combustion engines brought into the country past 2035. We already know that we're doing away with our most reliable power source, and that's coal-fired generators. And now we're walking down a path where they want to do away with gas. I see some scary times ahead for Australia. I think we're going to have to learn the hard way before we get back on track.
People have labelled, things like the COVID-19 and its response to it being something like a plandemic, as some of the wording that, people have used, because it looks so planned in the way, and there's some good conversations happening around like I mentioned before, Vivek Ramaswamy, he's talking about putting some huge requirements on China, for example, on the origins of the whole thing and whatever.
Yep. And
whether they'll ever even actually have a true conversation about that. But more to the point of to call it a pandemic implies that, for example, Anastasia Palaszczuk is some part of some, cabal where it's the theys, right? They are trying to reduce world population. They are trying to make us all eat bugs. They are trying to do this and that and the other. And in my mind, it's either a planned effort conspired from the highest levels of world powers, or it's complacency. And it's... I think that was the word you used earlier to do with, and unfortunately, I think it's probably the latter, in that it seems to be what.
And they're worried that if we don't come on board these so-called, for the betterment of the rest of the world, trade sanctions will be placed against us. We are so dependent now on global trade that the likes of Anthony Albanese and all of our premiers across the country are worried that if we don't play the game, their game, over in the United Nations, there will be trade sanctions placed on us. And we've seen what trade sanctions can do. Well, let's assume they used a different word. China used a different word when they blocked our barley and our coal and our wines and various other commodities that we couldn't send over there anymore. They are effectively trade sanctions, and it costs our economy billions of dollars. But we've worked up to this point where we do rely on exports. And the vast bulk of our exports are commodities, coal, iron ore, and then, of course, we've got a raft of others that are in high demand at the moment because of the renewable energy space, but also to food. So if we all of a sudden are told that we can no longer export those two, the impact it has both on government revenue and on business here in this country would be extraordinarily detrimental. So there's this belief that we've got to sign on to these accords or UN conventions that prevents us from then going into what would otherwise be seen as a trade sanction.
It makes sense.
That's why.
So it's for the betterment of the country.
Well, they'll say that, yeah. But often it's to the detriment. And often that can be the case as well with free trade agreements. We've got so many free trade agreements that are put in place, but generally we could do a deal to sell more wine into another country, but it's often at the detriment of another industry. And that's a problem in itself as well. They'll pick winners and losers when it comes to those free trade agreements.
Interesting. Do most people think about this kind of stuff, or is it just a little bit... I talk to people who are totally concerned and read up on every issue, talk to people who are, just couldn't care less. They're just, oh no, I don't keep up with that stuff. Don't watch the news, don't they? People just over it.
Well, to some extent, that should be the beauty of electing a person to Parliament, is that we don't have to think about these things. But the reality is, the more across global and domestic issues that we are, and it can be as simple as reading a newspaper every day, just to bring yourself up to the basics of what's happening in our Parliament and across the globe as well. It's a shame people don't take more of an interest, but I understand why they don't. We should be able to elect people who do take the same interest as our party does in all facets of what's happening to our country and us as a global player, because we are, whether we like it or not, we're still a global player. We might be a small country with 26.5 million people in it, but we play a significant role when it comes to feeding and providing the commodities that then are the building foundation of every other country across the place.
Interesting. I think I'm nearly out of questions.
That's a good thing.
I think, it's a very interesting political landscape that we're living in, and it's it's kind of scary. It's kind of concerning. It's kind of, hard to take some of these fears and concerns literally, because everything's so good. Our lives are so good. We live in fruitful times, and
is it though?
We drive on okay roads and live in nice houses. Is it,
But I think most people are starting to sit back and go, look, we can kid ourselves all we like. Things are a bit tougher now. And I only see things getting harder if people don't take an interest. And you don't have to be a university graduate. I came from very simple upbringings. We were a poor family, effectively. And I only realised probably 10 years ago that we were a poor family. And I remember going to school, actually, with, it was primary school, and we had these mixed fruit sandwiches. The mixed fruit they put in like a Christmas pudding, a Christmas cake. not nice. You know, the lemon peel,
Yeah.
the orange peel and so forth, and, you know, raisins and so forth. I remember going to school with these sandwiches that had mixed fruit on it and butter. And I only said to Mum, probably 10 years ago, I said, "Tell me, were we poor when we were kids?" And she looked at me and she said, "What makes you ask that?" And I told her about the mixed fruit sandwiches. And I saw her eyes glass up.
Oh.
And she said, "Yeah, we were. We were poor." And she said, "But my main focus at that time was to make sure you kids had something in your stomachs." And that is probably it's a really important discussion that I eventually had with Mum and Dad. But they were tough times back then as well. And we were poor, but it didn't stop me growing up with an education, taking pride in myself, applying myself, getting a job, doing all those things that we really should all be teaching our kids, is to apply themselves. And in the end, I look at where I've ended up. All of my three sisters and myself have all ended up in well-paid jobs, not because any of us went to university. In fact, none of us did, but because we applied ourselves. And a lot of those teachings are so important that I think we're seeing less and less of. And I really hope, for everyone's sake, that that we get back to a few of those basics, because it's important for the sake of the country and for the sake of future generations as well. Those basic things need to be instilled in all of us, so that we can take a bit of interest, so that we can think for ourselves, and not just take for granted what we do have for now, because we've seen other good countries like Argentina, who were very prosperous, probably more prosperous than us as a nation, go backwards to a point where their economy is ruined. And nothing stops this economy from ending up the same way. The only thing that does is taking an interest in where our politics is today and how we shape it in the future. And that comes down to who we elect.
That's a good way to end it. Take note of who your local members are. Get to know them. Get to know their policies.
Yep.
And, educate yourself, I guess, on...
Yeah. Education never stops. I'm forever learning. The minute you stop learning, you might as well give up on yourself.
I actually do have two more questions.
Oh, yeah.
Two more. Getting to know... how do I word this? Where do we find the truth? There's plenty of misinformation out there about COVID when it was all going down. Part of that was coming from our government.
Yep.
How do we find the truth? How does a modern media, our modern legacy media, whatever, because they kind of become a part of this as well, how do we as individual citizens find out what the truth is and where to find it?
Critical thinking is everything. And I always say to people, don't take my word for it. Go and do your own research. There's plenty of sources that are reliable, and stitch them together. And we're all naturally critical thinkers. It's how the human race evolved, because we are such critical thinkers. And I use the example with critical thinking. Kids are fantastic at it.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we stifle our own kids because of their creativity and the way in which they do think. But kids get the whole Christmas thing at some point. They believe one thing, and then they start to work things out for themselves. I'll leave it at that, because I don't want to spoil any kids that might happen to be watching this. But
the Tooth Fairy.
Yeah, great example.
Yeah.
Critical thinking kicks in, and you start to ask questions, and naturally you put it together. And I say that to anybody. We're all capable of coming up with the right answer. You don't always have to believe what you read and see in social media or in the newspaper.
Just think about it.
Definitely, yeah.
I think that's one of the things that I've said in conversations here, as well as obviously just doing it in my own life, is taking time to think. Because I don't like this thing. We say, oh, we're all busy and we're all this and we've all got... Like, yeah, but we've all got the same number of hours every day.
Sure. But the other thing is be prepared to be wrong too. You don't always have to be right. You can actually be wrong. You can change your mind. If you're convinced by evidence, be prepared. Be open-minded enough to say, I was wrong, or I'll take this different viewpoint now. That's important too.
Critical thinking and humility.
Yeah.
Because you, I guess, are making the best informed decision you can based on the information you're presented.
Mm-hmm.
And if that information ends up being incorrect or was based on false premise or whatever it ends up being, just go, yeah, well, I was wrong.
Correct. And there's nothing wrong with being wrong. Nothing. Just whether you're prepared to admit it or not.
I like that. How long should the government fund, let's say, certain education programs and systems, and health for that matter?
Yep.
How long should spending, because people are always looking for more money. Oh, we need to spend more on this. We need to spend more on that, whatever. How long should spending go up and outcomes come down before we actually change something?
Well, that's a good question. And we see this all the time. We see politicians or governments of the day brag about how much money they've spent on something, whether it be roads, whether it be education, whether it be hospitals, anything like that. But you have a look at the outcomes, they're actually decreasing. Education's the classic. We spend more and more on education, and yet we've got kids in Pacific nations being educated with dirt floors, and they've got better outcomes than the over $17 billion has been dedicated to Queensland schools. And yet our education standards are doing this. And it's not just 1 year. This is consecutive year after year after year. We're doing worse. So you tell me where we're going right or wrong. The more money you spend doesn't necessarily give you better outcomes.
And it's not just a teaching, parents like to blame teachers for their kids not performing. I've taken a position of late that a lot of the things we say these things, the government should insert whatever.
Yep.
I've thought of a few key areas. The church, right? If you're of any religious persuasion, typically people will blame, whether they've left or done this. The church did this terribly, or the church that, or it's education. Teachers this, teachers need to do more of this, and my child's not performing because of that. I would say with confidence, majority of those circumstances, not saying there's not issues and things to address in each of them and mistakes haven't been made, but guaranteed most of those scenarios fall into the failure of parenting and the family unit. I
couldn't have said it better. And I speak to teachers. It's so easy to blame somebody other than yourself. And look, in a lot of circumstances, like when I speak to teachers, I've got one mate of mine that has told me that he's got grade 2 students still defecating themselves in class. And toilet training is typically provided by the parents, not by a school. And when you've got kids turning up to a classroom that haven't been fed in the morning, the discipline's not there. They're turning up without it'd be like a plumber turning up with no tools. Kids are turning up to school with no books, no pencils, no just bare basics. When I went through primary school, everything was supplied. We didn't take anything home, to be quite frank. So the books, the pencils, the bare basics were supplied by the school. Perhaps it's something we've got to look at into the future to ensure that no child is left behind on that front. It shouldn't be the responsibility of a school to feed your kids. It shouldn't be. I don't know, we're missing something. And I drive around towns now and I just see the lack of pride. As I said to you, we weren't a rich family. We were very poor. But so were most of the families at the time when we grew up. But lawns were mowed, yards weren't disgusting, beds were made, kids still wore shoes. We were a different time, I guess, but pride does not cost money. You can still take pride in yourself. And I think there's a lot of pride missing in society today. And that is being made more and more evident through the way that kids have been raised as well. That's clearly not the majority, but it's an increasing number that sadly we're seeing. And that has long-term ramifications, not just on those kids, but on society as a whole.
Well, appreciate you making the time to chat. You're clearly you're clearly in touch with a lot of these issues based on your role currently. And you clearly think about stuff. You've clearly thought a lot of this through. And it's always insightful hearing what you have to say.
Yeah, good.
And definitely encourage people to give you a little follow along wherever you are appearing on your guest appearances on Sky News or
good.
Wherever you're up next. But yeah, it's always an interesting conversation when I talk to you. And I think a lot of people should definitely listen to what you have to say.
I appreciate the time.
Thanks.